She looked like any other teenage girl, quiet, respectful, first-class ticket in hand. But the flight attendant didn't care. One glance, and she made up her mind. She accused the girl of being in the wrong seat, embarrassed her in front of the entire cabin, and sent her to the back without asking a single question. The passengers watched in silence. No one stood up, no one defended her. But what the flight attendant failed to notice was the man sitting silently in the next row, calm, composed, watching everything. He wasn't just her father. He was the billionaire who owned the airline. And the moment he pulled out his phone, the entire flight changed forever. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell icon so you don't miss the next one. She sat quietly near the window, her fingers gently curled around the armrest of her first-class seat. Her name was Ava. She wore a light gray hoodie and simple jeans, nothing flashy, just comfortable. Her small backpack was tucked neatly under the seat in front of her, and a paperback novel rested on her lap. She had boarded the flight alone, holding her boarding pass like it was something fragile. This was her first time flying without family, and although there was a hint of nervous energy in her chest, she felt proud. Her father had surprised her with this ticket after her school results came in. Straight A's, just like he'd hoped. "You've earned a little taste of comfort," he'd said with a smile. So here she was, seat 1A, looking out the window at the loading crew on the tarmac, her heart steady, not knowing that in a few minutes, the entire cabin would be looking at her differently. The sound of heels tapping softly against the aisle carpet grew louder. It was Claire, the lead flight attendant. Her blonde hair was pinned tightly back, and her uniform looked like it had just come out of a dry cleaner's press. Claire had been working for this airline for more than a decade, and she had a reputation among the crew. Confident, strict, and always in control. She was doing her pre-flight check when her eyes landed on Ava. Her steps slowed. Her expression changed. Not shock, not confusion, just disapproval. She walked closer, stopping at Ava's row with a slight tilt of her head. "Hi there," Claire said, her voice polite but with an edge that wasn't easy to miss. "Are you sure you're in the right seat?" Ava looked up, surprised. "Yes, I'm in 1A." Claire held out her hand. "May I see your boarding pass, please?" Ava handed it over without hesitation. Claire looked at the ticket and paused. Her lips pressed into a thin line as her eyes flicked between the printed seat number and the girl sitting in front of her. Then she glanced around, noticing a few passengers already watching. She lowered her voice just slightly, but not enough to make the moment private. "Where did you get this ticket?" she asked. "My dad booked it," Ava replied, confused. Claire tilted her head. "Is he flying with you today?" "Number, I'm flying alone." Claire returned the ticket, but didn't move. Her posture became more rigid. "This seat is reserved for paid first-class passengers only. It's not for upgrades or promotional flyers." Ava's eyebrows lifted. "I didn't get upgraded. My dad bought it. This is my seat." Claire's tone shifted sharply. "Look, sweetheart, I don't know what happened at the gate, but you need to move to the back. You're holding up the boarding process." The words hit harder than they sounded. Ava blinked. She could feel eyes on her now. No one said a word. Not one person asked what was going on. She swallowed the lump in her throat, reached down for her backpack, and stood. She didn't argue. She didn't cry. But something inside her, something small and strong, broke in that moment. As Ava walked past the rows of silent passengers, Claire stood tall behind her, satisfied, as if she had solved a problem no one else noticed. Ava found a seat near the back of the plane, next to an empty row. She sat down quietly, slid her bag under the seat again, and stared blankly ahead. Then she took out her phone and typed a short message. "She made me leave first class, and she slapped the ticket from my hand." She pressed send. Just a few rows behind where Claire had been standing earlier, a man named Richard adjusted his cufflinks and unlocked his phone. He had just received the message. His jaw clenched slightly. He didn't look up. He didn't say a word, but he read the text again, slowly. Richard wasn't just any passenger. He was Ava's father, and he owned the airline. Ava sat in the economy seat, her eyes fixed on the seat back in front of her, though her mind was far from the cramped space. Her fingers trembled slightly in her lap, but her face stayed still. The hum of the engines hadn't even begun, yet the flight already felt unbearable. Her cheeks still burned from the embarrassment and her chest ached. Not from what Claire had done, but from the silence of the people around her. Not one person had spoken up. Not one passenger had said, "Let her stay." She had followed the rules. She had a valid ticket, and still she had been treated like she didn't belong. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down. "Richard." "What do you mean she made you leave? What happened?" Ava hesitated, then typed quickly. "Ava." She looked at me, didn't believe my ticket was real, and told me to move. She said I didn't belong there. A pause. Then another buzz. "Richard, what's the flight number?" Her heart picked up speed. She knew that tone. Short, precise, controlled. Her father wasn't the kind of man to raise his voice. He never needed to. When Richard spoke, people listened. She fumbled through her backpack, found the boarding pass, and sent the flight number immediately. Another message appeared just seconds later. "Richard, stay where you are. Do not worry about anything." Ava let out a slow breath. She didn't know what he was going to do, but she trusted him. He always kept his promises. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, Claire moved through the first-class cabin with calm purpose, offering smiles to the other passengers as if nothing had happened. She passed by Richard without recognizing him, without even looking at him. Her attention was focused on organizing trays, folding blankets, and checking seatbelts. To her, the incident with Ava was just a routine correction. Another mistake fixed. Another non-paying passenger sent back to her appropriate place. But Richard hadn't taken his eyes off her. He sat still, dressed in a tailored navy suit with a small silver pin on his lapel, a symbol only a few in the airline industry would recognize. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But his presence began to shift the air around him, the kind of calm that feels more dangerous than rage. He opened his phone, tapped a single contact labeled Control HQ, and placed the call. By the time Claire returned to the galley to pour herself a cup of coffee, the cockpit had already received a call from airline headquarters. A flight manager was already waiting on the in-flight call screen, and a captain, who had been flying for over 20 years, was turning in his seat to listen closely to what was about to unfold. Claire didn't know it yet, but the man she just removed from her cabin wasn't the girl in the hoodie. It was the man sitting silently in 1B, and she had just humiliated his daughter. Inside the cockpit, the call from airline headquarters came through with quiet urgency. The co-pilot glanced at the captain, who nodded and tapped the screen on the in-flight communication panel. A senior operations officer appeared on the monitor. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "Captain Reynolds, we have an issue involving a first-class passenger who was removed from her assigned seat. Her name is Ava Matthews." Captain Reynolds straightened in his seat. "Acknowledged. What's the situation?" The officer's tone dropped. Her ticket was valid. She was seated in 1A. A flight attendant forcibly moved her to economy. That passenger is the daughter of Richard Matthews. The name settled into the cockpit like a thunderclap. Captain Reynolds didn't react outwardly, but inside, every instinct told him this wasn't going to end quietly. He had heard the name Richard Matthews many times before, CEO of the airline group, a man who rarely traveled with a security detail, who preferred to operate from behind the curtain, but whose influence stretched through every division of the company. If he was on board, things were about to get serious. The officer continued, "Mr. Matthews is currently seated in 1B. He hasn't said a word, but he contacted executive control directly. He wants the situation handled immediately and personally." Captain Reynolds nodded once. "Understood. Summon the flight attendant who removed the passenger, now." Claire stood in the galley, stirring sugar into her coffee with a small smirk on her lips. She hadn't thought twice about sending Ava to economy. In her mind, She had done the airline a favor, upholding standards, maintaining order. She didn't notice the awkward silence that had spread among the other attendants, or the subtle glances in her direction. The intercom buzzed overhead. "Ms. Claire Henson, please report to the cockpit immediately." The spoon in her cup clinked hard against the ceramic. She froze for a second, unsure if she heard correctly. When she looked up, the other attendants quickly turned away, pretending to be busy. She set down her coffee, straightened her uniform, and walked stiffly toward the front. As she passed through the first-class aisle, she didn't notice Richard watching her. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But his stare followed her until she disappeared into the cockpit. When she entered, Captain Reynolds motioned toward the seat beside him. She sat, confused, glancing at the monitor. The man from headquarters looked at her with narrowed eyes. "Ms. Henson, a first-class passenger was removed from her seat. Ava Matthews." "Explain." Claire cleared her throat, forcing a smile. "Yes, there was a young girl in 1A. She appeared to be in the wrong section. I asked her to move. It was a simple correction." "Did you verify her ticket?" the officer asked flatly. I looked at it briefly. I didn't recognize the name. She seemed out of place." Captain Reynolds raised an eyebrow. "You made her move based on how she looked?" Claire hesitated. "I made a judgment call. She didn't seem like a first-class passenger." The officer leaned forward on the screen. "Ms. Henson, the girl you humiliated is the daughter of Richard Matthews, your employer, the owner of the airline you're standing in right now." Claire's breath caught. I didn't know." "You didn't ask," the officer said coldly. Captain Reynolds gave a slow exhale. "Orders from Mr. Matthews are clear. You will return to Ava Matthews, apologize in front of the passengers, and personally escort her back to first class. Upon landing, you will report to the executive board for a formal review." Claire sat frozen in place, color draining from her cheeks. She had no words, only the sudden, sickening realization that the girl she had dismissed like an inconvenience held more power than anyone else she had ever encountered in the sky. And now, she was the one being summoned, and her career had just hit turbulence she would not recover from. Claire stepped out of the cockpit with her hands slightly trembling, though she tried hard not to show it. Her polished composure, the one she wore like armor every flight, had cracked. The moment she passed back into the first-class cabin, she could feel the change in the air. It was subtle, but suffocating. Passengers who had smiled at her earlier now looked away. A few watched her with quiet curiosity, as if they sensed something was off but weren't sure what. And one man, Richard, sat motionless in 1B, his gaze steady, unreadable, but colder than she had ever felt from any passenger. Her footsteps were slower now as she walked the long aisle toward the back. The once light hum of the aircraft seemed louder, almost mocking. The eyes of fellow crew members followed her from the galley. No one said a word. No one offered help. This walk, it seemed, she would have to do alone. Ava sat in her cramped economy seat, earbuds in, staring out the window. Her face was calm, but her body sat stiffly like she didn't quite know how to relax. She hadn't cried, not once, but that didn't mean she wasn't hurting. The way Claire had spoken to her, the stares from strangers, the quiet shame of having to stand and walk down that aisle like she didn't belong, none of it had faded. She hadn't expected justice. Not here, not today. So when Claire finally stopped beside her row, Ava didn't react at first. She felt her presence before she heard her voice. "Miss Matthews," Claire said quietly, crouching a little to lower herself to Ava's level. Her voice was thinner now, almost uncertain. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Ava pulled out one earbud and turned to look at her. Her expression didn't change. Claire gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'd like to escort you back to your original seat, first class." Ava looked at her for a long moment. No movement, no response. "I apologize," Claire added quickly. "If there was any inconvenience." Now Ava's expression shifted, only slightly. "You're calling it a misunderstanding?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. Yes, an error in seating. Ava's voice remained soft, but every word cut deeper than raised voices ever could. You saw my ticket, and you still told me to move. A quiet murmur rippled a few rows ahead. Passengers were listening. Some of them had seen it all earlier. Claire swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat. I may have made a mistake in judgment, she said. Ava tilted her head slightly. That's not the same as a misunderstanding. Claire's throat tightened. Ava reached for her phone again and typed a short message to her father. Ava, she's asking me to come back now. What should I do? A moment later, the reply came through. Richard, take your time. Make her understand what she did. Ava placed the phone back in her bag and looked Claire in the eye. I'll go back, she said calmly. But I want to know why you thought I didn't belong there. Claire opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her gaze dropped to the floor. You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket, Ava continued. Just me. Why? The silence that followed was heavier than anything else spoken. Passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Some stared straight ahead, faces tight with discomfort. Others glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. When she entered, Captain Reynolds motioned toward the seat beside him. She sat, confused, glancing at the monitor. The man from headquarters looked at her with narrowed eyes. Ms. Henson, a first-class passenger was removed from her seat. Ava Matthews. Explain. Claire cleared her throat, forcing a smile. Yes, there was a young girl in 1A. She appeared to be in the wrong section. I asked her to move. It was a simple correction. Did you verify her ticket? The officer asked flatly. I looked at it briefly. I didn't recognize the name. She seemed out of place. Captain Reynolds raised an eyebrow. You made her move based on how she looked? Claire hesitated. I made a judgment call. She didn't seem like a first-class passenger. The officer leaned forward on the screen. Ms. Henson, the girl you humiliated is the daughter of Richard Matthews, your employer, the owner of the airline you're standing in right now. Claire's breath caught. I didn't know. You didn't ask, the officer said coldly. Captain Reynolds gave a slow exhale. Orders from Mr. Matthews are clear. You will return to Ava Matthews, apologize in front of the passengers, and personally escort her back to first class. Upon landing, you will report to the executive board for a formal review. Claire sat frozen in place, color draining from her cheeks. She had no words, only the sudden, sickening realization that the girl she had dismissed like an inconvenience held more power than anyone else she had ever encountered in the sky. And now, she was the one being summoned, and her career had just hit turbulence she would not recover from. Claire stepped out of the cockpit with her hands slightly trembling, though she tried hard not to show it. Her polished composure, the one she wore like armor every flight, had cracked. The moment she passed back into the first-class cabin, she could feel the change in the air. It was subtle, but suffocating. Passengers who had smiled at her earlier now looked away. A few watched her with quiet curiosity, as if they sensed something was off but weren't sure what. And one man, Richard, sat motionless in 1B, his gaze steady, unreadable, but colder than she had ever felt from any passenger. Her footsteps were slower now as she walked the long aisle toward the back. The once light hum of the aircraft seemed louder, almost mocking. The eyes of fellow crew members followed her from the galley. No one said a word. No one offered help. This walk, it seemed, she would have to do alone. Ava sat in her cramped economy seat, earbuds in, staring out the window. Her face was calm, but her body sat stiffly, like she didn't quite know how to relax. She hadn't cried, not once, but that didn't mean she wasn't hurting. The way Claire had spoken to her, the stares from strangers, the quiet shame of having to stand and walk down that aisle like she didn't belong, none of it had faded. She hadn't expected justice. Not here, not today. So when Claire finally stopped beside her row, Ava didn't react at first. She felt her presence before she heard her voice. Miss Matthews, Claire said quietly, crouching a little to lower herself to Ava's level. Her voice was thinner now, almost uncertain. "There seems to have been a misunderstanding." Ava pulled out one earbud and turned to look at her. Her expression didn't change. Claire gave a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'd like to escort you back to your original seat, first class." Ava looked at her for a long moment. No movement, no response. "I apologize," Claire added quickly. "If there was any inconvenience." Now Ava's expression shifted, only slightly. "You're calling it a misunderstanding?" Claire hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, an error in seating." Ava's voice remained soft, but every word cut deeper than raised voices ever could. "You saw my ticket, and you still told me to move." A quiet murmur rippled a few rows ahead. Passengers were listening. Some of them had seen it all earlier. Claire swallowed hard, her palms beginning to sweat. "I may have made a mistake in judgment," she said. Ava tilted her head slightly. "That's not the same as a misunderstanding." Claire's throat tightened. Ava reached for her phone again and typed a short message to her father. "Ava, she's asking me to come back now. What should I do?" A moment later, the reply came through. "Richard, take your time. Make her understand what she did." Ava placed the phone back in her bag and looked Claire in the eye. "I'll go back," she said calmly. "But I want to know why you thought I didn't belong there." Claire opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her gaze dropped to the floor. "You didn't ask anyone else in first class for their ticket," Ava continued. "Just me. Why?" The silence that followed was heavier than anything else spoken. Passengers nearby had stopped pretending not to listen. Some stared straight ahead, faces tight with discomfort. Others glanced at each other, eyebrows raised. Her hands trembled as she reached for the counter to steady herself, but she didn't dare sit. The silence in the narrow space felt heavier than the roar of any engine. Every moment replayed in her mind. The moment she made Ava move, the dismissal in her own voice, the smug satisfaction she'd felt walking back to the galley thinking she had done the right thing. And now? That confidence had turned into something cold and bitter sitting in her chest. Emma was still standing in the corner, watching her. The younger attendant didn't say anything this time. She didn't have to. The quiet judgment in her eyes said enough. Claire had trained her, taught her how to deal with difficult passengers, how to manage tight cabins and demanding flyers. But this time, it was Emma who looked like the professional, and Claire who stood there unraveling. Claire pulled a napkin from the drawer and wiped her palms. She could still feel the weight of Richard Matthews' eyes. He hadn't yelled. He hadn't confronted her directly. But every glance, every word, every controlled command carried more pressure than a public outburst ever could. That man was used to being in control of corporations, not just people. And now she was in his hands, powerless. She turned and stared at the coffee machine just to give her hands something to do. But her mind kept circling back to Ava. The way she spoke, so calm, so sure. It was maddening in a way Claire couldn't explain. She wasn't used to that. She had dealt with rude passengers, arrogant ones, entitled ones. But Ava hadn't raised her voice. She didn't insult or demand anything. She simply asked why, and Claire had no answer that didn't sound ugly out loud. "You should probably sit down before you collapse," Emma finally muttered. Claire turned to her sharply, her voice tight. "I don't need your comments." Emma lifted her hands, her expression unreadable. "Just saying, you're really sweating this." Claire didn't respond. She hated how her hands were still shaking. Emma crossed her arms. "If I'm being honest, I don't think she's the one who's sweating. That girl's been sitting there like a queen since she came back. And you look like you're about to throw up." Claire clenched her jaw. "That girl humiliated me." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Number, she asked you a question. You humiliated yourself." Claire didn't reply. Her throat tightened. Emma sighed. "Look, I get it. Maybe you didn't mean it the way it came out. Maybe you've made calls like this a dozen times and no one ever noticed. But you picked the wrong person this time. You made it public. And now it's public for you too." Claire leaned against the counter, finally letting her arms fall to her sides. She looked down at the polished floor, her voice low. "I didn't think—" Emma cut in gently but firmly. "That's the problem. You didn't think. You saw a girl who didn't fit your idea of first class, and you acted." Claire's lips parted, but no words came out. She wanted to say she was just following protocol, that she was protecting the experience for others. But even she didn't believe that anymore. In the cabin, Ava sat back in her seat, legs crossed, glass of sparkling water in hand. She wasn't smiling, she wasn't sulking. She simply existed, composed, unbothered, aware of her space in the room. But the energy around her had changed. The same passengers who had looked through her earlier now stole glances over their newspapers and screens. Some looked embarrassed, some curious. One man across the aisle shifted in his seat and leaned slightly toward her. I saw what happened earlier," he said hesitantly. Ava looked at him. "Yes?" He cleared his throat. "That was, unfortunate. I mean, clearly a mistake." Ava tilted her head. "A mistake?" He fumbled. "Well, she probably didn't mean it that way." Ava's voice stayed even. "She saw me. Assumed I didn't belong. Didn't ask. Didn't verify. Just told me to move." The man hesitated. "Right. But she didn't know who you were." Ava gave a small smile, one that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And if I wasn't anyone important, would it have been okay then?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. Ava turned away, ending the conversation without another word. She didn't need validation. She didn't want it. She had already said what needed to be said. Her phone buzzed again. Another message from her father. "Richard, we land in 45 minutes. Sit tight." She stared at the screen for a moment, then replied, "Ava, I'm good. Watching everything unfold." She placed the phone on the tray and leaned back. The seat was comfortable again, not because of the leather or the space, but because this time she belonged in it. And there was no one left who could question that. Back in the galley, Claire stood rigid, pretending to arrange the drinks cart while the reality of her situation closed in on her like a tightening grip. Every few seconds, she glanced toward the curtain separating her from the first-class cabin, as if trying to measure how far she could stay away from the consequences of her actions. But the distance was an illusion. Her name was already whispered in the aisles, her behavior already dissected in hushes and glances. There was no hiding anymore. Not from the passengers, not from her crew, and certainly not from herself. Emma said nothing else. She didn't need to. The silence between them said everything. Claire had once been the one giving orders, correcting posture and reminding new attendants about protocol and image. But now she was just standing. Her badge didn't feel like authority anymore. It felt like weight. Then the in-flight phone on the wall buzzed again. Claire jumped slightly, her pulse rising. She reached for it with a shaking hand and pressed the receiver to her ear. "This is Claire," she said, her voice stiff. The voice on the other end was smooth and slow, but unmistakably firm. "This is Richard Matthews." Her breath caught. For a second, the world went still. "I trust," he continued. "You've understood who I am and what you've done." She couldn't find words. "I've already spoken with operations," he said. "There will be a formal review. You'll be expected to explain every part of your conduct on this flight. Every decision, every word, every expression." Claire finally spoke, barely above a whisper. "Mr. Matthews, I'm not interested in excuses," he said, cutting her off. "This isn't about me. It's about my daughter. You made her feel like she didn't belong. You treated her like a problem. And you did it in front of strangers who chose to stay silent." She clenched her jaw, the shame spreading across her skin like fire. "You'll ensure that she receives the same level of service that every first-class passenger receives. Exactly the same. Nothing more. Nothing less." "Yes, sir," she managed to say. The call ended with a soft click. Claire slowly lowered the phone, her stomach twisting. Her knees felt unsteady, and she had to grab the counter again to stay upright. Every part of her had been built to control cabins like this. Decades of flying, handling emergencies, enforcing policy. But now, she couldn't even control her own voice. She turned to Emma, who was watching her again. Emma raised an eyebrow. "That him?" Claire nodded once. Emma exhaled. "Well, he didn't scream." "No," Claire muttered. "He didn't have to." In the cabin, Ava continued to sit with quiet poise. She had returned to her book, though she wasn't really reading. Her thoughts drifted through each moment since the flight began. The awkward confrontation, the walk of shame down the aisle, the silence of the people who watched, the forced apology, the shift in energy once they all realized who her father was. It bothered her. Not because they were afraid of him, but because no one had stood up when it actually mattered. Only now, after power entered the picture, did people care. She glanced sideways. Some passengers had resumed pretending she wasn't there. A few still glanced now and then. She ignored them all. Another buzz on her phone. "Richard, she won't speak to you again unless necessary. I made that clear." Ava smiled slightly. "Ava. Good, I'd rather she didn't." She sipped her sparkling water and leaned back, letting her mind wander, until she noticed the man seated across the aisle leaning slightly toward her again. He was older, sharply dressed, the type who had probably flown first class for decades. His voice was low, cautious. "I just want to say, what happened earlier wasn't right," he said. "You handled it with remarkable patience." Ava looked at him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." He hesitated, then added, "You know, most people wouldn't have stayed so calm, especially at your age." Ava's lips curved into a faint smile. "That's the thing," she said quietly. "If I had screamed or shouted, I'd be labeled angry or emotional. But if I stay calm, people say I'm impressive." The man looked slightly uncomfortable. I didn't mean to." "It's okay," she said gently. "I've heard it before." He nodded awkwardly and turned back to his magazine. Ava didn't take it personally. She was used to this. People always had opinions about what strength should look like, what manners should sound like, who belongs where, and now they were all being forced to rethink it. In the cockpit, Captain Reynolds was still in communication with ground control. Every few minutes, updates flowed in, from the operations manager, from legal teams, from the corporate board. Richard Matthews hadn't made a scene on board, but his presence had stirred the entire system. Preparations were underway for landing, private security, executive transport, internal review teams. The plane wasn't just approaching the airport, it was approaching fallout. "Captain," the co-pilot said carefully, "is it true he's the majority stakeholder?" Reynolds gave a slow nod. "It's true." "Then what happens when we land?" The captain's eyes stayed on the sky. "Someone's going to answer for this, and I'm guessing she has no idea how bad it's going to get." The slow descent began as the plane's altitude dropped gradually, but the tension inside the first-class cabin didn't follow suit. Instead, it grew tighter, thicker, like invisible pressure building behind every breath. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the intercom crackled to life with Captain Reynolds' calm, practiced voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've begun our descent. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened, tray tables up, and devices secured. We'll be landing shortly. Thank you." To most passengers, it was a familiar announcement, just another flight nearing its end. But to Claire, every second ticked louder than the last. She stood stiffly in the galley, staring at the closed cabinet doors in front of her, trying to steady her breathing. She had counted minutes before, on delayed flights in turbulence through emergency landings, but never like this. This wasn't fear of the air. This was fear of what waited when the wheels touched the runway. Behind her, Emma leaned against the counter, arms folded, watching silently. The younger attendant hadn't said anything since the last call came in. She didn't have to. Her presence was like a mirror now, reflecting what Claire didn't want to see, how she had fallen, how fast it had all come apart. "You okay?" Emma asked quietly. Claire didn't answer at first. Then after a few seconds, she gave the weakest nod. "Fine." No, you're not, Emma said gently. You're holding your breath like you're expecting a crash. Claire exhaled slowly, then turned, her voice barely holding steady. He's sending people to meet the plane, executives, security. They're going to take me straight from the gate. Emma didn't flinch. You expected anything else? Claire stared down at her hands. I thought maybe I could explain, say it was a mistake. Emma shook her head. A mistake is when you forget to offer someone water, not when you look at a teenage girl and decide she doesn't belong. That's not a mistake, Claire. That's a choice. Claire opened her mouth to argue, but closed it again. The defense she had clung to earlier had already crumbled. And now, standing there in the cold galley air, the truth hit harder than any rebuke. She had seen Ava, judged her, and acted on nothing but a feeling. And now she was about to face a consequence she had never imagined in all her years of flying. Ava sat still, watching the city lights grow larger through the oval window. The glass shimmered slightly with reflection, and beyond it, the world moved on, indifferent to what was unfolding inside the cabin. She checked her phone one more time. Richard. Stay seated. Security is waiting at the gate. She smirked faintly and responded. Ava. Got it. I'm not moving this time. She placed the phone down and folded her hands in her lap. Around her, passengers shifted in their seats, their eyes flicking from tray tables to screens to each other. Some were still pretending not to notice her. Others weren't pretending at all. Ava didn't care. She felt no need to speak, no desire to demand anything. Her silence had become her strength, and everyone felt it now. The same flight attendant who had dismissed her hours ago was now hiding behind a curtain, and the cabin that had watched her walk away in shame would now watch someone else walk out in it. Ava leaned back and tilted her head just enough to glimpse her father in the seat beside her. He hadn't said much since she returned, but he hadn't needed to. His presence alone had shifted everything. Where Claire had power through routine, Richard held power through certainty, through silence, through knowing he never had to raise his voice to be heard. He looked at Ava now and gave her a nod. She nodded back. Nothing needed to be said. They had always understood each other best in quiet moments. The wheels touched the runway a few minutes later, and the plane rolled along the tarmac with its usual hum. But the atmosphere inside was anything but routine. There was no usual excitement, no light chatter about connecting flights or hotel bookings. There was only anticipation, a strange stillness that settled over every row. The intercom buzzed again. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to our destination. Local time is 3:45 p.m. Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate and the seatbelt sign is turned off. On behalf of our crew, thank you for flying with us. As the cabin lights brightened and the seatbelt sign dinged off, Ava didn't move. She glanced once more toward the galley curtain, but it didn't stir. Claire remained hidden. Passengers began gathering their belongings slowly, but their attention stayed forward. The tension was no longer curiosity. It was expectation. People were waiting for something. And then it happened. A soft click of the front cabin door, a pair of footsteps, and into the plane stepped a uniformed security officer. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and carried no visible weapon, yet his presence alone shifted the air once again. Every eye turned to him. The passengers in the front rows stopped mid-movement. The officer scanned the cabin calmly, then spoke with quiet clarity. Claire Henson. Silence. Then, slowly, the curtain at the galley pulled aside. Claire stepped out, pale and composed but visibly trembling. Yes, she said softly. You'll need to come with us. Passengers gasped. A few exchanged looks. Others stared straight ahead, wide-eyed. Claire tried to keep her expression neutral. Is there a problem? The officer didn't blink. There have been reports of a discriminatory incident involving the removal of a first-class passenger. Mr. Matthews has requested a formal review. You'll be escorted for questioning. Claire nodded slowly. Her legs felt stiff, her arms heavy. She turned to walk down the aisle, the same aisle Ava had walked hours earlier. Except this time, every step Claire took felt like a mirror image of her mistake. As she neared Ava's seat, she glanced sideways, just once. Ava didn't smirk. She didn't gloat. She simply watched. Calm, still, unmoved. And somehow, that was worse than any reaction Claire had feared. Claire's shoes tapped softly against the floor as she walked the aisle, the security officer trailing just behind her. Every row she passed felt like a courtroom gallery. No one said a word, yet every passenger was a silent witness. Some watched with interest, others with subtle discomfort, a few with quiet satisfaction, but none with pity. She had walked this aisle hundreds of times before. Back then her steps carried purpose and command, but now they felt hollow, each one heavier than the last, each step a countdown to an end she had never imagined. She kept her eyes forward, but she could feel the glances piercing her from every angle. She could feel the weight of their judgments, the flickers of their thoughts. She's the one. That's her. That's the woman who sent the wrong girl to the back of the plane. When she reached the first-class section, she made the mistake of turning her head. Ava sat still, her face unreadable, calm as ever. There was no smugness in her eyes, no cruelty, just observation, the kind that made a person squirm without needing a single word. Claire looked away immediately. She stepped off the plane and into the jet bridge. The temperature outside the cabin felt colder, sharper, as if the air itself had changed. At the end of the corridor stood two men in suits, their expressions as flat as glass. Airline executives. She recognized one of them, Daniel Crow, director of flight operations. The other, she didn't know. They didn't smile, they didn't nod. They just turned and motioned for her to follow. Claire did. She didn't ask where they were going. She already knew. They entered a restricted hallway tucked behind the gate, one that passengers never saw. It led to administrative offices, interview rooms, and spaces meant for crew evaluations. The walls were pale gray, the lights too bright. Sterile. Empty. At the end of the hall was a room with a long table, 3 chairs, and a closed door. Claire was told to sit. Daniel remained standing. The other man, his name tag read James Walton, Executive Compliance Manager, took the chair across from her. A leather folder rested in front of him. He didn't open it right away. He just looked at her for a long moment. "You know why you're here?" he asked. Claire nodded, but her voice was dry. "Yes." He tapped the folder lightly with 2 fingers. "This file contains a report from the flight captain, statements from at least 4 passengers, and a formal complaint from Mr. Richard Matthews." Claire swallowed. "I didn't know who she was." "That's not the problem," James said calmly. "The problem is that you treated her like she didn't belong before knowing anything about her. You didn't verify her ticket properly. You didn't ask her politely. You made an assumption based on how she looked. Then you acted on it. Publicly." Claire shifted in her seat. "It wasn't personal. I've had incidents like this before. People sneaking into first." James raised a hand, stopping her. "Was anyone else in first class asked to show a ticket?" Claire hesitated. "Just her?" he asked. "Yes." He exhaled slowly. "Claire, do you understand the position this puts the airline in? This wasn't just a minor seating issue. You didn't just remove a teenager from a seat. You embarrassed the daughter of the company's CEO in front of a plane full of passengers, while her father sat 10 feet away." Her eyes welled up, but she blinked quickly, refusing to let them fall. "I made a mistake." "No," James said quietly. "You made a choice, and that choice wasn't just wrong, it was dangerous. You represented this airline. You created a public relations disaster that's already trending on 2 major platforms. Passengers were filming. Someone posted the video before the flight even landed." Claire felt the words hit her like a punch to the chest. She had imagined damage, but not this. "We're suspending you without pay," James continued. "Effective immediately. You'll be notified of a disciplinary hearing within the next 72 hours. Until then, you're prohibited from entering airline facilities or contacting any current employees. Claire looked down at the table. Her voice was barely audible. Is there any chance to fix it? James tilted his head. That depends. On what? On whether you're willing to admit what you did and why it happened, he replied. This isn't about protecting your job anymore. It's about acknowledging your judgment. If you can't do that, then no, there's no coming back. He stood up and closed the folder. You can leave now. A staff member will escort you out. Claire didn't move right away. Her legs felt numb. Her throat burned. She had spent over a decade building her name on the crew roster. She had managed in-air emergencies, led onboarding sessions, trained junior staff, and built a record with no major complaints. And now? She was walking out under suspension, her badge stripped, her name whispered across terminals. As she stepped outside the room, the cold fluorescent light followed her down the hallway like a spotlight, and behind her, the door shut with a quiet finality. Meanwhile, in the executive lounge on the other side of the terminal, Ava sat across from her father, a warm drink in her hand, her posture relaxed. The room was quiet, designed for comfort, soft lighting, leather chairs, polished wood accents. A few other travelers sat in distant corners, none of them aware of who she was or what had just taken place. Richard leaned forward slightly, his eyes on her. You okay? He asked. Ava nodded. Yeah. They didn't bother you again after you went back to your seat? No, she said. I think they were scared to. He gave a short laugh, not unkind. Good. She sipped her drink. She's being suspended? Richard nodded. For now. Ava raised an eyebrow. You're giving her a chance to explain? I believe in accountability, he said. But I also believe in change. If she owns what she did, if she really understands it, maybe she can come back from it. And if she doesn't? Ava asked. Richard leaned back. Then she won't work for us again. Ava nodded thoughtfully, her expression unreadable. She won't own it, she said quietly. People like her never do. Richard didn't argue. He just looked at his daughter, still so young, but steady in ways that impressed him beyond words. And he knew, this wasn't just a lesson for one crew member. This was a warning to an entire system. The rules were changing, and this time, someone like Ava was the reason why. Claire sat on the edge of her bed hours later, still wearing the same uniform that now felt like a costume, tight at the collar, rough at the seams. The apartment was quiet, too quiet, as if even the walls knew something had ended. Her airline-issued tablet sat dark on the nightstand, locked out of the crew system the moment her suspension was activated. The phone in her hand buzzed once, then stopped. She didn't bother checking. She had no interest in texts from coworkers who now wanted to distance themselves. The same people who once complimented her leadership would now be whispering behind her back. She reached for a glass of water but set it down untouched. Her hands were still unsteady. The flight felt like it had happened days ago, and yet it played in her mind with perfect clarity. Ava's face, Richard's voice, Emma's silence, the cold expression on the executives' faces, and worst of all, the walk of shame past all the passengers she had once believed she was above. For 10 years, she had lived by the handbook, procedures, protocol, professionalism. She had memorized every emergency manual, passed every evaluation, and worn her stripes like a badge of honor. She had believed herself fair, efficient, respected. But now, in the stillness of her apartment, all of that felt like a carefully painted surface, cracked and exposed. Her eyes drifted to the email on her phone screen. Subject: Suspension notification from Airline Executive Board. Effective immediately, you are placed on unpaid suspension, pending a formal review regarding conduct on Flight 748. A disciplinary hearing will be scheduled within the next 5 business days. You are prohibited from accessing airline systems or premises until further notice. The language was sterile, emotionless, but its meaning screamed at her. She was no longer part of the airline. She wasn't Claire, the senior crew lead. She wasn't the one other attendants deferred to. She wasn't anything, except a liability waiting to be judged. Her fingers hovered over her inbox when a new message appeared. From Richard Matthews. Subject: accountability. She stared at the name for a long time. She hadn't expected direct contact from him, not after everything. Her thumb hovered over the message until she finally tapped it open. Ms. Henson, I'm sure by now you understand the seriousness of what happened on Flight 748. I won't restate what the board has already outlined, but I believe in accountability, and that includes giving people the chance to acknowledge their mistakes. I'm offering you that chance now. If you wish to formally apologize to my daughter, I will ensure she receives your message. However, I want to be clear. This is not an apology for me nor for the airline. It is for her. If you cannot bring yourself to do that, then I see no reason for this conversation to continue. I'll wait for your response. Richard Matthews. Claire set the phone down as if it had grown heavier. The message wasn't long, but every sentence had weight. There were no threats, no shouting, just opportunity, and the demand that she finally face the mirror she had been avoiding. She stood up, walked to the kitchen, poured herself a second glass of water, and this time forced herself to drink. She needed clarity. For years, she had believed she was fair because she followed rules. But now she saw it more clearly than she wanted to admit. Rules had been her excuse for never questioning her own bias. It wasn't the first time she had judged a passenger by appearance. She knew that. But it was the first time her decision had public consequences, and that was what made her uncomfortable. Not the act itself, but the fact that it had been seen. She returned to the bedroom, sat back down, and opened a new message. Her hands hovered over the keyboard. Subject: accountability. She paused, took a breath, and began to type. Mr. Matthews, I don't expect your forgiveness. I'm not writing this to justify what I did. I'm writing this because I understand, now, how wrong it was. I misjudged your daughter. And worse, I did it with confidence. I treated her like she didn't belong, not because of her behavior, not because of a mistake, but because I assumed she couldn't be in that seat. I've worked in this industry for 10 years, and I let that experience convince me I was above that kind of judgment. But I wasn't. I let my own bias speak louder than the facts in front of me, and for that, I'm ashamed. I would like to apologize to Ava directly if she is willing, but I also understand if she isn't. Either way, I wanted her to hear it. I was wrong. Claire Henson. She reread the message once, then again, before pressing send. The moment it left her outbox, she leaned back and closed her eyes. No badge, no uniform, no control. But for the first time in days, maybe for the first time in years, she felt something real. Not power, not authority, just humility. And that, she hoped, was at least a place to begin. Ava sat in her father's office, legs tucked under her in one of the sleek leather chairs, quietly scrolling through her phone. Outside the wide glass windows, the city hummed with its usual afternoon rhythm. Cars gliding by below, sunlight catching on steel rooftops. But inside, there was silence. The kind that only came after a storm. The kind where the dust was still settling. Richard sat behind his desk, deep in thought, flipping through a printed report filled with passenger statements, social media fallout logs, and internal crew messages. The incident had spread faster than either of them had expected. A shaky passenger video of Claire demanding Ava leave first class had surfaced that morning. Then came hashtags, then news blogs. Headlines read, "Black teen removed from first class. Turns out her father owns the airline. Billionaire CEO's daughter wrongfully sent to economy. Flight attendant under fire." But Ava wasn't interested in what the world was saying. She had seen enough internet opinions to last a lifetime. Her eyes were fixed on one email in particular. It had come just 15 minutes ago, forwarded to her by her father. From Claire Henson. Subject: my apology. Her finger hovered over it for a moment before she tapped it open. Ava, I know I don't deserve your time and I won't waste it with excuses. You didn't deserve what I did to you. You weren't wrong. You weren't out of place. I was. When I told you to move, I wasn't thinking about rules. I was thinking about what I expected to see in first class. And when I didn't see it, I acted. That wasn't just unprofessional. It was wrong. I can't undo it. But I can promise that I will never let myself make that mistake again. If you're willing to accept it, I would like to apologize to you in person. If not, I understand. Either way, I just wanted you to know. I see my mistake now, and I'm truly sorry. Claire Henson. Ava read the email twice, then locked her phone and placed it on the desk beside her. She didn't say anything right away. Her father looked up from his papers, studying her expression carefully. Do you want to respond? He asked. Ava leaned back in the chair, her arms folded loosely across her chest. I didn't expect an apology. Not a real one, Richard agreed. And this one? He asked. Ava was quiet for a moment. It doesn't feel fake. She's not begging. She's not trying to save her job. It sounds like she really understood it. Richard nodded. She's lost everything she built in the last 10 years. Ava's eyes didn't change. Good. He tilted his head slightly. She didn't sound cruel, just honest. She didn't hesitate to humiliate me, in front of strangers, and the only reason she regrets it now is because she got caught. Richard leaned forward. That may be true. But people don't change if we don't give them space to learn. I know, Ava replied. But I don't want to shake her hand and tell her it's okay. Because it wasn't. And I'm not interested in making her feel better about it. He respected that. Completely. So, he asked. Ava opened her phone again, began typing slowly, her thumb steady and her words clear. Subject, my apology to Claire Henson. Claire, I read your message. I appreciate that you didn't try to defend yourself. That means something. Most people don't get to see what they've done until it affects their own lives. I don't need an in-person apology. Not because I'm angry, but because I think you already know how it felt. This wasn't just about you and me, it's about everyone who gets judged before they open their mouth. I was lucky. My father was sitting behind me. But most people don't have someone powerful watching. I accept your apology. Not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn. Ava Matthews. She hit send without overthinking it. Richard gave her a look of quiet admiration. You handled that with grace. Ava shrugged. I didn't forgive her for her. I did it for myself. They sat in silence for a few moments. Then his phone buzzed with a message from the boardroom down the hall. They're ready for me, he said, standing up. You going to tighten the policies? She asked. Already in motion, he replied. Mandatory bias training, new reporting channels, stronger oversight in first class, every crew member's getting a reminder that appearances aren't policy. Ava smiled faintly. You're changing the whole system because of one flight. He leaned over and kissed the top of her head. I'm changing it because of who they tried to erase from it. She watched him leave, then turned back toward the window. She wasn't proud because someone had been punished. She was proud because something had been exposed. And if it took one humiliating flight to make that happen, then maybe it was worth it. Claire sat alone in her apartment the next morning, curled on the edge of her couch in silence. Her uniform, once the symbol of professionalism and control, hung limply from a hook on the back of her door. It hadn't been touched since she came home. Neither had the airline-issued tote by the wall, still packed with a notepad, pens, and her broken sense of pride. The morning sun poured through the blinds, casting long lines of light across the floor, but they didn't warm her. Everything around her felt muted. She had received no new emails from the airline, no calls, just silence. A suspension without noise, the kind that screams only in your own head. She had thought the apology might give her some relief, some sense of redemption, but after sending it, the weight didn't leave. If anything, it settled deeper in her bones. When her phone buzzed, she hesitated to check it. She wasn't ready for more bad news, for more board updates, or another formal notice. But when she did glance at the screen, what she saw made her freeze. Subject: My apology from Ava Matthews. She opened it slowly, bracing for rejection, for bitterness, for silence. But what she read instead was something she hadn't expected. Claire, I read your message. I appreciate that you didn't try to defend yourself. That means something. Most people don't get to see what they've done until it affects their own lives. I don't need an in-person apology. Not because I'm angry, but because I think you already know how it felt. This wasn't just about you and me. It's about everyone who gets judged before they open their mouth. I was lucky. My father was sitting behind me. But most people don't have someone powerful watching. I accept your apology. Not because you deserve it, but because I believe people can learn. Ava Matthews Claire blinked at the screen for a long time, her fingers hovering above it like she might respond, though she didn't yet know what to say. She read the words again, slowly, carefully, and this time, they hit differently. Ava hadn't forgiven her to make her feel better. She hadn't said anything flowery or kind. She hadn't opened the door to friendship or closure. But she had acknowledged Claire's apology. She had seen her, not as a victim, not as a villain, but as a human being capable of both failure and growth. It wasn't comfort, but it was clarity. Claire leaned back against the couch, covering her face with her hands. Her chest tightened, not with guilt this time, but with something else. Recognition. A bitter understanding that what she'd lost wasn't just her job or her dignity in the eyes of others, but her own blind faith in her judgment. The realization that she had spent years believing herself fair, when fairness had only ever been applied to those who looked like they belonged. That was the wound Ava's silence had left. Not the humiliation, not the corporate fallout, not the shame, but the truth. Ava didn't have to scream to be heard. She didn't need to drag Claire's name through headlines. She had just sat there, calm, composed, firm, and forced the world to look at what it usually ignored. And now, Claire would carry that lesson into every room, every conversation, every decision that would follow, whether she ever wore a flight attendant badge again or not. In another part of the city, Ava sat by the window of a quiet cafe, notebook open, pen twirling between her fingers. She wasn't writing, not yet. She was watching, observing the world outside, couples walking, cars honking, people rushing past without knowing her name, without knowing what had just shifted inside an industry they trusted every day. She didn't need to be the headline. She didn't need credit. She only cared that it didn't happen again, that someone else wouldn't be told to move just because they didn't look the part, that someone else wouldn't be humiliated and left to swallow the shame in silence. Her father had already begun making changes. He had already launched the internal memo across departments. Every airline employee, from ground staff to cabin crew, would now go through mandatory inclusion training. Not a video, not a box-checking exercise, but a real, live, person-led session with one goal: unlearn what you've never been made to question. Ava took a slow sip of her tea. She had thought long and hard about whether to respond to Claire's message, and ultimately, she chose to. Not because she believed Claire had earned it, but because growth deserved acknowledgement, even if the harm was unforgivable. She didn't want to carry hate that was too heavy, too bitter. She had her voice, she had her dignity, and now she had change, tangible, measurable change that would impact thousands of faces like hers every single day. Across the table, her friend Mia finally returned from the counter, sliding into the seat and placing her coffee down. "Sorry, line was long," Mia said. "What were you thinking so hard about?" Ava smiled faintly. "Just how fast things can change when someone finally says, 'No more.'" Mia sipped her drink and nodded. "And how powerful it is when the world is forced to listen." Ava's phone buzzed again. Another message from her father. "Richard, the board approved the new policy. First round of sessions begin next month. You started something, Ava. I'm proud of you. She stared at the message for a moment, then typed back, Ava, it's not about pride, Dad. It's about doing what they never expected us to do. Stay seated. She hit send and closed the notebook, and for the first time since the flight she felt something return that the humiliation had almost stolen from her. Peace. Not the kind that comes from an apology, but the kind that comes from knowing you changed something that tried to erase you. 2 weeks had passed since Flight 748 had landed, but its effects continued to ripple far beyond the runway. News outlets, travel blogs, and advocacy groups were still discussing it. What had started as a quiet injustice, one teenage girl being removed from first class, had grown into a national conversation about appearance-based bias, gatekeeping in elite spaces, and silent discrimination dressed up as procedure. But inside the walls of Matthews Aviation Group, the tone was less sensational and far more personal. At the company's quarterly executive summit, Richard Matthews stood before a room of regional managers, senior advisors, and operations heads. The conference room was spacious, modern, with large display screens and spotless glass walls. But today, the conversation inside it wasn't about profits or passenger volume. It was about people. This isn't about just one flight, Richard said, looking at the faces in the room. This is about a culture we've allowed to grow quietly. A belief, sometimes spoken, sometimes not, that comfort and dignity are privileges, not rights. That a first-class seat says something about who you are. I've seen it firsthand. My daughter lived it. He paused, then continued, his tone calm but firm. I'm not interested in corporate apologies. I'm interested in impact. I'm interested in systems that prevent that kind of judgment from becoming action, and that begins with each of you. There were no nods of agreement, no polite murmurs, just silence. The kind that meant people were actually listening. One of the managers finally raised a hand. Mr. Matthews, are you suggesting changes to crew discretion policies? I'm not suggesting, Richard replied. I'm implementing. He clicked a remote and the screens behind him displayed the new policy rollout plan. Mandatory bias awareness training for all employees, including senior leadership. Real-time passenger incident reporting through a new internal app to escalate issues immediately to oversight teams. Onboard surveillance review protocols, making it mandatory to review any crew-initiated passenger movement. Behavioral evaluation in promotions, tying leadership advancement to peer-reviewed behavioral reports, not just flight hours or tenure. Passenger experience accountability, where every incident flagged by customers triggers a live human follow-up, not just automated replies. The list was long, expensive, ambitious, but no one in that room could argue its necessity. Richard looked around the table one more time. We can't control how people think the moment they see someone, but we can control how they're allowed to act on it in this company. And if someone doesn't like that, they're welcome to work elsewhere. Meanwhile, across town, Ava stood at the front of a university lecture hall. She had been invited by a sociology professor to speak. Word of the airline incident had reached the campus, and Ava's response to it had caught the attention of more than just industry leaders. She didn't wear anything flashy, just jeans, a long sweater, and a calm expression that seemed almost too steady for someone her age. Her hands rested on the wooden podium, but her voice was clear. When I was removed from first class, no one stood up. No one asked the flight attendant to stop. That wasn't what hurt the most. What hurt was that I expected that. I wasn't surprised. I had been trained, by life, to keep my head down, to avoid being labeled difficult, to be polite while being humiliated. The room was silent. She continued, her tone steady but charged. I didn't speak up right away because I didn't want to cause trouble. I didn't want to make people uncomfortable. But what I learned is that people who stay silent when they have power are more dangerous than the ones who show their bias out loud. She looked up, her gaze sweeping the rows of students. My father owns an airline. That's the only reason this story ended the way it did. But what about the people who get removed and don't have someone powerful behind them? What about the ones who never get their seat back? That's why I spoke up. Not to get revenge, but to make sure it mattered. Not just for me, but for everyone who was told to move quietly. Applause didn't erupt. It rose slowly, sincerely. Students stood, clapping with eyes that didn't just admire her, they respected her. After the talk, as she packed up her things, a young woman approached her. She was quiet, nervous, holding a small notebook. "Hi," she said softly. I wanted to say thank you. I was removed from a train once. I had the right ticket, but the staff didn't believe me. I didn't fight. I was too scared." Ava looked her in the eyes and smiled gently. "You're not alone. And your silence then doesn't make your voice less important now." The girl's eyes welled up, and she gave a small, grateful nod before turning to leave. Ava turned back to her bag, placed her notebook inside, and zipped it shut. Later that evening, she sat with her father at the same dinner table they had eaten at since she was a child. No corporate boardrooms, no press, just the two of them. He placed a steaming bowl of pasta in front of her and smiled. "You were on the campus bulletin today," he said. "A professor sent me your speech." She smiled as she picked up her fork. "Don't worry, I didn't bring shame to the company." He chuckled. "On the contrary, you've reminded us what the company should be." They ate quietly for a moment. Then Richard spoke again. "Would you ever want to work in aviation?" Ava looked up, thoughtful. "Maybe, but not from the top. I think I'd rather be on the ground, talking to passengers, listening, seeing the things no one reports." Her father leaned back and nodded slowly. "That's how real change begins." Ava smiled. She didn't need a title to have power, she had a voice. And now people were finally listening. Weeks turned into months, and the story of what had happened on Flight 748 began to fade from headlines, replaced by newer controversies, fresh outrage, and the ever-moving news cycle. But within the walls of the airline, and within the lives it had touched, the impact remained permanent. Claire Henson sat quietly in a modest interview room inside the airline's training center. She wasn't wearing her old uniform, not yet. Today wasn't about returning to work. It was about reflection, growth, a second chance, if she was willing to prove she'd earned it. Across from her sat 2 human resource officers and a senior member from the Diversity and Inclusion Board, a new role the airline had created in response to the incident. Claire had completed every required training, attended all 3 behavioral review sessions, and submitted a personal reflection report that had made its way to Richard Matthews himself. Now it came down to one question. Had she truly changed? She sat with her back straight, voice steady, not rehearsed but honest. "I can't take back what I did," she said. "I can't undo the fact that I humiliated someone because I assumed she didn't belong. But I've faced that part of myself now. Not just in training, but alone, at home, in the mirror. I've had to ask why I made that choice, why I thought I was upholding rules when really, I was upholding bias." The room was quiet. One of the officers nodded slowly. "I know that Ava Matthews doesn't owe me forgiveness," Claire continued, "but she gave it anyway, and I've chosen not to waste that. Whether I wear this uniform again or not, I'll carry that lesson with me for the rest of my life." There were no dramatic tears, no emotional appeals, just quiet accountability. Later that week, she received an email. Subject: Reinstatement. Probationary return to duty. She stared at the message for a long time. It didn't feel like a victory. It didn't feel like redemption. It felt like a door that had closed, being opened just enough for her to step through, but only if she walked differently this time. She accepted the terms. And when she returned to the air for the first time in 4 months, she greeted every passenger with equal sincerity, asked every question without assumption, and watched herself more closely than anyone else ever could. Not because she was being watched, but because she understood now respect isn't a policy, it's a practice. Ava, meanwhile, had returned to a quieter rhythm. Her name no longer trended. Her story wasn't the center of attention, but the policies she inspired remained active, reviewed quarterly by the compliance board her father created, on her suggestion, not his. She continued speaking on occasion, at schools, seminars, and youth panels, not to retell her story, but to help others recognize theirs. She didn't want to be known just as the billionaire's daughter. She wanted to be remembered for what she did when no one expected her to do anything. One afternoon, she received an envelope. Handwritten, no branding. Inside was a short letter. Ava, I wanted you to know that I flew again today. Same airline, first class. A little girl boarded in a hoodie, nervous, alone. This time, I didn't question her ticket. I offered her a drink. I asked about her day, I watched her smile, and I realized something. Sometimes the smallest moments carry the loudest change. Thank you. Claire Ava smiled softly, folding the letter with care and tucking it into her notebook. She didn't reply. She didn't post about it. Some things she believed were meant to be kept close, to be remembered not as statements, but as shifts. Later that week, as she boarded a flight with her father, not in first class but coach by choice, she passed a young black boy in the front row, legs swinging as he played with the airline's tablet. The flight attendant serving him knelt down to his level with a smile. Would you like a snack or a drink, sweetheart? You've got the best seat in the house. And Ava smiled. Because maybe now. They all did. If you like this story, give the video a thumbs up. Share your thoughts in the comments and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories coming soon.